In 1321, a poet placed 9 circles beneath the surface of the earth and gave each one a climate, a bureaucracy, and a population. The afterlife of the Inferno of Dante Alighieri would go on to shape sermons, maps, pilgrimages, and even the architecture of fear. And this is the life story of that system of gates people now call the 7 gates of hell. It was not born from fire. It was born from argument. The problem that created it was the problem of justice. How to reconcile the mercy of God with the cruelty of men, and how to stage punishment in a way that felt orderly rather than arbitrary. Lesser known fact: in early manuscripts of the Divine Comedy, marginal notes by copyists show adjustments to the order of sins, evidence of a design compromise between strict theology and narrative flow. Its parents were not demons, but institutions, the universities of Bologna and Paris, the canon lawyers of the 13th century, the politics of Florence, and the preaching orders of Dominican order and Franciscan order. The doctrine of gradated sin had been forming for centuries through scholastic debate, especially in the Summa Theologia of Thomas Aquinas, which classified vices with near-legal precision. Lesser known fact: medieval theologians disagreed on the temperature of hell. Some argued for literal fire, others for privation of divine presence, showing an early countermeasure against overly literal readings. The image of gates emerged from scripture and from city life. Fortified cities of Italy had gates that controlled movement, taxed goods, and separated citizens from outsiders. Metaphors followed masonry. In sermons of the late Middle Ages, preachers spoke of gates as thresholds of moral choice, often using 7 as a symbolic number tied to the 7 deadly sins. Lesser known fact: in some 14th century sermons, the number of gates fluctuated between 7 and 8, reflecting a production issue of theological consistency rather than settled doctrine. Before Dante, there were earlier descents. Virgil had guided readers through the underworld in the Aeneid, and apocryphal texts such as the Apocalypse of Peter had offered graphic tours of punishment. These were prototype sketches of terrain and justice without the architectural coherence that would define the Florentines' design. Lesser known fact: medieval illustrations of these earlier texts often misread classical geography, placing rivers of the underworld in climates modeled on northern Europe, a weather impact of local imagination on universal myth. When Dante wrote of gates and circles, he was writing from exile. Politics of Florence had fractured between Guelph and Ghibelline, and he had been sentenced to death in absentia. Exile gave him distance and bitterness sharpened the taxonomy of sin. Lesser known fact: estimates vary, but at least 600 manuscript copies of the Divine Comedy circulated before the invention of print. A remarkable supply chain for a work that was once politically sensitive. The gates were not literal in his poem. The architecture was metaphorical, layered, descending, yet readers would later compress 9 circles into 7 gates, aligning the poem with the schema of 7 deadly sins for ease of teaching. That compression was a childhood misunderstanding of the system, an attempt to simplify doctrine for parish audiences. Lesser known fact: some 15th century catechisms explicitly labeled the circles as gates in marginal glosses, a battlefield, improvisation of pedagogy to fit oral preaching time limits. Childhood of this idea was messy. Artists painted infernal doors and frescoes, each labeled with a vice, and local variations proliferated. In Florence, frescoes of the Last Judgment showed mouths of Leviathan as entry points. In Padua, doors resembled city gates with battlements. Lesser known fact: pigment shortages during outbreaks of plague led some workshops to reuse panels, resulting in underdrawings of saints beneath devils, a production issue that left ghostly traces visible under modern infrared analysis. Training of clergy in seminaries included memorization of the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, lust paired with virtues. Confessors were taught to diagnose sin like physicians diagnosing disease. Lesser known fact. Confession manuals of the 5th-10th century often included checklists with numeric prompts, an early crew training detail that standardized moral triage across dioceses. Early failures were theological and pastoral. Excessive emphasis on hell risked despair among the faithful, and despair was itself considered a sin. The Church responded with preaching of hope, balancing terror with mercy. Lesser known fact. Records of episcopal visitations in the 16th century show bishops reprimanding priests for overuse of infernal imagery, a command doctrine shift aimed at preventing psychological collapse among parishioners. With the invention of print in the mid-5th-10th century, the system entered growth. Editions of the Divine Comedy multiplied after 1472. An illustrated version standardized certain visual motifs: gates, flames, descending terraces. The printing houses of Venice became factories of the afterlife. Lesser known fact. Early woodcuts sometimes reused blocks between biblical scenes and infernal scenes to save costs. A design compromise that blurred visual boundaries between history and allegory. Mass production changed reception. By the 16th century, schoolboys in Italy read Dante alongside Latin classics, and the idea of structured descent became cultural common sense. Commentaries proliferated, each interpreting the geography of sin with scholastic precision. Lesser known fact. One Venetian edition misnumbered cantos due to a typesetting error, a production issue that caused decades of citation confusion among scholars. Logistics of dissemination extended beyond Italy. Translations into Spanish, French, and later English carried the architecture of gates into other confessional battles. During the Reformation, Protestant polemicists sometimes invoked Hell's Gates against Rome, turning Dante into a rhetorical weapon. Lesser known fact. In some English Protestant tracts of the 17th century, woodcuts of infernal gates were repurposed from Catholic devotional books. A battlefield improvisation in print culture. Standardization of the 7 sins became catechetical doctrine. Manuals of moral theology in seminaries across Europe listed the sins in fixed order, often tied to mnemonic devices. This was the moment of institutional maturity. Lesser known fact. Jesuit schools in the 17th century incorporated dramatic performances of infernal scenes as part of rhetoric training. A crew training detail that fused theater with theology. The system of gates also migrated into architecture. Medieval and early modern churches sometimes carved grotesques near portals, symbolically placing hell at the threshold of sanctuary. Pilgrims passed beneath warnings carved in stone. Lesser known fact. Weathering of limestone on cathedral facades in northern climates gradually softened infernal carvings. A terrain impact that visually diluted terror over centuries. Peak came not in medieval Italy, but in the modern imagination. In the 19th century, artists such as Gustave Doré engraved dramatic visions of Dante's hell, and mass-produced prints circulated across Europe and America. Doré's gates were monumental, shadowed, industrial in scale. Lesser known fact. Doré completed 76 illustrations for the Divine Comedy, a test result of artistic endurance that required coordination with engravers over several years. Industrialization provided new metaphors. Factories, mines, and prisons were described as hellish. The language of gates applied to rail yards and foundries. The idea of descending levels of punishment mapped onto modern bureaucracies. Lesser known fact. During the First World War, soldiers in trench letters occasionally referred to frontline sectors as gates, a psychological effect of cultural memory applied to industrial war. Cinema amplified the peak. Early silent films depicted infernal descents with painted backdrops and smoke machines. By the 20th century, horror films used literal gates open into flame. The number 7 became shorthand for stages of suffering. Lesser known fact. Special effects in early 20th century films often relied on double exposure techniques to simulate flames, a production constraint that shaped the visual grammar of hell. Why did it work? It's because it provided structure. Human beings facing chaos, plague war, political exile found reassurance in a map of consequences. The gates promised that evil would not scatter into randomness, but would be cataloged and judged. Lesser known fact: psychological studies of the late 20th century found that belief in structured afterlife punishment correlated with higher reported perceptions of moral order, a medical and psychological effect of doctrine on cognition. There was also fear. Sermons describing infernal gates aimed to deter sign through vivid imagery. In some revival movements, preachers spoke for hours on the torments of each gate. Lesser known fact: revivalist reports from 18th century New England mentioned fainting and physical tremors among listeners during hellfire sermons, a medical effect documented in church diaries, but cost accumulated. Overemphasis on hell contributed to scrupulosity, a condition of obsessive fear of sin. Spiritual directors struggled to balance warning with compassion. Lesser known fact: early psychiatric case notes from 19th century Europe describe patients haunted by visions of infernal gates after intense religious upbringing, a psychological burden linked to doctrinal emphasis. The gates also shaped politics. Rulers invoked hell in proclamations, casting enemies as destined for infernal entry. Religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries used imagery of damnation as propaganda. Lesser known fact: during the 30 Years' War, pamphlets on both Catholic and Protestant sides depicted rival leaders entering flaming portals, a countermeasure of print culture weaponizing theology. Old age of the system began with secularization. Enlightenment thinkers questioned literal readings of hell. Treating it as metaphor, philosophers reframed punishment as social contract rather than divine decree. Lesser known fact: in 18th century France, censorship records show confiscation of certain infernal tracts deemed too inflammatory, a command doctrine shift from ecclesiastical to state control of moral messaging. New science altered terrain. Geology revealed deep time in layers of earth older than biblical chronologies, undermining literal subterranean models. Astronomy expanded the cosmos beyond medieval spheres. Lesser known fact: sermons in the 19th century increasingly described hell as a state rather than a place, a design compromise adapting doctrine to scientific discovery. Replacement did not erase legacy. Modern literature reimagined Descent considered the underworld journeys of 20th century novels. In films, the structure of gates survives in video games, theme parks, and haunted attractions. Lesser known fact: surveys of contemporary horror media show recurring use of 7 stages or levels, a production pattern reflecting deep cultural memory. Melodies learned from the metaphor as well. Training manuals speak of layers of defense, gates of access, and thresholds of escalation. The language of Dante seeps into strategic vocabulary. Lesser known fact: U.S. military doctrine occasionally uses the term gates in network security architecture, a supply constraint of metaphor, bridging theology and cyber defense. What did later designs copy? The hierarchy of sin, the narrative of descent with guide, the pairing of punishment with symbolic logicon trapezo, as Dante called it, punishment mirroring crime. Lesser known fact: modern legal theory sometimes references proportionality in sentencing as a secular echo of contrapeso, a command doctrine shift from divine to civil justice. And what did societies learn? That images endure longer than arguments. The gates of hell, born of medieval scholasticism and poetic exile, outlived the politics of Florence and the battles of Guelph and Ghibelline. Lesser known fact: UNESCO estimates that the Divine Comedy remains among the most translated works of medieval literature, a production legacy spanning over 700 years. In quiet museums, manuscripts rest behind glass, ink faded but legible. The gates no longer threaten as they once did, yet they remain in language, in art, in metaphor. The life of this thing, this architecture of moral descentra, is never about geography. It was about order imposed on fear and the enduring human need to believe that even in darkness, there is a structure, a count, and a reckoning. In 1996, a fire in northern Canada burned more than 1.6 million hectares in a single season. What most people never realized is that some of the hardest fighting in that season was not between nations, but between crews and a living, moving front, a flame that behaved like an army. This is the story of wildfire in northern Canada, not as scenery, not as disaster footage on the evening news, but as an organized opponent shaped by wind, fuel, terrain, and time. Lesser known fact: under extreme conditions, a crown fire in elf forest can advance at speeds exceeding 5 kilometers per hour, fast enough to overrun heavy equipment if escape routes are not planned. Before there were air tankers, before incident command systems, before satellite heat maps, there was simply forest. The belt stretches across Canada for roughly 5,500 kilometers, from Yukon through Northwest Territories, northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and into Labrador. It is one of the largest intact forest ecosystems on Earth. Lesser known fact: about 28% of the world's forest lies within Canada, making it a global center of carbon storage and fire-driven ecology. Fire is not new here. Lightning has ignited northern forests for thousands of years, particularly in June and July when dry thunderstorms sweep across the interior. In many regions, natural fire cycles range from 50 to 200 years depending on forest type and moisture. Lesser known fact: black spruce cones are semi, meaning heat of fire helps release seeds, a design compromise of evolution that ties reproduction to flame. But the modern war began when human settlement expanded northward. Mining towns, hydroelectric infrastructure, indigenous communities, highways, pipelines. These created fixed targets in a landscape once allowed to burn freely. Fire that was once ecological process became operational threat. Lesser known fact: in the 1970s, federal and provincial policy began formal zoning of values at risk, prioritizing suppression near communities while allowing remote fires to burn under monitored conditions. Before large-scale suppression, tools were simple. Hand crews with axes and shovels cut fire breaks down to mineral soil. Water pumps drew from lakes and rivers. Smoke was the only early warning system. Lesser known fact: early forestry manuals in Canada emphasized 10-meter wide hand-cut fire guards as standard in moderate fuels, a training doctrine shaped by labor availability rather than fire behavior modeling. Then aviation changed the equation. After the Second World War, surplus aircraft and trained pilots were available. By the 1950 and 1960, water bombers became central to suppression strategy in provinces like Ontario and Quebec. Lesser known fact: the CL-215, first flown in 1967 by Kachkoop, approximately 5,400 liters of water in about 12 seconds. A mechanical innovation tailored specifically to Canadian lake-dense terrain. What did it feel like to face wildfire up close? Veterans of fire crews describe sound first: a low roar that grows into something like continuous thunder. Heat becomes directional, wind shifts without warning. One account suggests visibility can drop to near zero in thick smoke even at midday. Lesser known fact: radiant heat from a crown fire can exceed 20,000 kilowatts per meter, enough to ignite structures without direct flame contact. The escalation accelerated in the late 20th century. Climate data show warming trends in northern latitudes at roughly twice the global average. Snow melts earlier, fire seasons lengthen. Estimates vary, but some studies suggest the average fire season in parts of Western Canada has extended by several weeks since the 1970 lesser-known fact. In 2014, Northwest Territories experienced one of its largest fire seasons on record, with over 3.4 million hectares burned, straining national resource sharing systems. Tactical problem. Fires were starting in remote regions where ground access was limited or non-existent. Response: increased reliance on helicopters for crew insertion and bucket drops. Consequence: aviation budgets rose sharply and risk to pilots increased. Lesser known fact: helicopter bucket operations require precise hover over water sources, and downwash turbulence can destabilize small craft nearby. A safety issue noted in aviation briefings. Another tactical problem: simultaneous ignitions during lightning storms overwhelmed local capacity. Response: creation of interprovincial mutual aid agreements under the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center. Consequence: crews and aircraft now move across provinces during peak seasons. Lesser known fact: was formally established in 1982 to coordinate national resource sharing, a logistical system that mirrors military reinforcement doctrine. People often think suppression means extinguishing every fire. That is myth number one. In reality, Canada practices a modified response policy in remote northern zones, allowing some fires to burn under surveillance to reduce fuel loads. Lesser known fact: in some L regions, less than 10% of annual ignitions receive full suppression response, dependent on proximity to communities and infrastructure. Myth number two: water alone stops a wildfire. Water cools and slows flame, but without removal of fuel or change of weather, fire can re-establish. Firefighters rely heavily on hand lines, bulldozer lines, and controlled. Lesser known fact: controlled operations require precise wind alignment, often within a window of less than 10 degrees of directional tolerance. According to training guidelines. Myth number three: winter solves the problem. Snow cover suppresses flame, yes. But winter planning is crucial because spring thaw creates rapid fuel drying on exposed slopes. Lesser known fact: some provinces conduct prescribed burns in early spring when snow still lies in shaded areas, using residual moisture as natural containment barrier. The hidden system behind wildfire management is vast. It includes meteorologists analyzing wind shear and humidity, fuel specialists modeling fire spread using Canadian Forest Fire Weather Index components, logistics officers managing food, fuel, and rest cycles. Lesser known fact: the Fire Weather Index system, developed in Canada in the 1970s, is now used internationally as benchmark model for predicting fire intensity. Training is rigorous. Entry-level firefighters undergo physical fitness tests that include timed pack carries and hose lays. Crews practice deployment of fire shelters, last cocoons designed to reflect radiant heat. Lesser known fact: Canadian agencies issue fire shelters but emphasize escape and avoidance. Actual deployment rates are low compared to some U.S. incidents, reflecting doctrine of early withdrawal. Supply constraints are constant. Remote camps require food shipments by air, fuel for pumps, and generators must be cached ahead of time. Mechanical breakdown of a single pump can compromise a fire line. Lesser known fact: lightweight Mark III portable pumps, widely used in Canada, can deliver roughly 350 liters per minute, but require regular maintenance of impellers to avoid performance loss. Then came Fort in 2016, a wildfire in northern Alberta forced evacuation of approximately 88,000 residents. It became one of the costliest natural disasters in Canadian history, with insured losses estimated over 3.7 billion Canadian dollars. Lesser known fact: during peak operations, more than 2,000 firefighters, 150 helicopters, and dozens of air tankers were deployed. testing the upper limits of national coordination. The tactical problem there was urban interface. Dense housing developments met forest edge. Wind gusts carried embers across fire breaks. Response: structure protection units deployed sprinklers on rooftops and around perimeters. Consequence: some neighborhoods survived while others did not. Lesser known fact: ember attack accounts for a significant percentage of structure ignition in urban interface fires, sometimes exceeding 60%, according to fire investigation reports. What people also get wrong is belief that more aircraft always equals better outcome. Aviation is constrained by visibility, wind, and daylight. Smoke columns can ground fleets. Lesser known fact: heavy smoke can reduce visibility below minimum safe flight thresholds of 1 to 3 miles, depending on aircraft type and regulations. Another myth: this is solely a Canadian issue. Smoke from boreal fires routinely travels into the United States and even across the Atlantic. Satellite imagery has shown plumes reaching Europe under certain atmospheric conditions. Lesser known fact: in 2023, smoke from Canadian wildfires significantly impacted air quality in cities like New York, with particulate matter levels exceeding 100 per cubic meter on some days. The escalation continues with climate feedback loops. Warmer temperatures dry peat layers beneath forests. When peat ignites, fires can smolder underground for weeks or months. Suppression becomes exponentially more difficult. Lesser known fact: peat fires can burn at depths of more than 30 centimeters below surface, resisting water application unless saturation is complete. Medical effects on crews are real. Long shifts, often 12 to 16 hours, under heavy smoke exposure, increase fatigue and respiratory strain. Firefighters rotate to reduce cumulative exposure. Lesser known fact: studies of firefighters have documented elevated levels of carbon monoxide in blood after prolonged shifts, though usually within manageable limits under monitored conditions.